Right now, somewhere in your relationship, she's telling you exactly what she needs, and it sounds like an insult. Maybe it happened last week. Maybe it happened this morning, over something small. A comment about how you parked the car, or handled a decision, or answered a simple question at dinner. And it stung more than it should have, longer than it should have. Here's what almost no man realizes in that moment. He hears the words. He never hears what's underneath them. That's not a flaw in you. It's how the male brain is built to process conflict. Threat first, meaning second, every single time. So the sting registers instantly, while the actual signal underneath it gets lost before you have a chance to notice it was there. It happens quietly. It happens constantly. And most men go years without catching it in the act. Which raises the real question. The one we're going to answer together today. What is she actually telling you when she cuts you down? And why does almost every man read it backwards? By the end of this video, you won't just understand what's happening. You'll be able to hear it clearly, in real time, the next time it does. It's usually small. That's what makes it land so hard. Think back to a moment that felt almost unremarkable at the time. You made a decision about dinner or a weekend plan or how to handle something at home. And she said something short and cutting in front of you, or worse, in front of someone else. Maybe it was about your driving, the way you took a turn a little too wide. Maybe it was the way you told a story at dinner, and she corrected you mid-sentence with a tone that carried an edge you couldn't quite name, in front of people you both knew. You laughed it off. You had to. There wasn't really another option in the moment, not without making it a bigger thing than it already felt. But something about it sat with you longer than it should have. Later that night, or the next morning, replaying itself uninvited while you were doing something completely unrelated. Of course, everyone has an off moment. A single sharp comment on its own rarely means anything close to what we're about to talk about here. People get tired, people get short, and sometimes a comment really is nothing more than that. But when it repeats, when it becomes a pattern instead of a one-time slip, something else is happening underneath it, something worth actually paying attention to. Here's the part that surprises most men when they finally see it clearly. It's rarely about the thing she actually said. The comment about your driving was never really about your driving. The comment about the story you told was never really about the story itself or how you told it. There is almost always a second layer running underneath the first one, quieter, less obvious, and far more revealing than anything on the surface. Most men never go looking for it because the sting of the words is loud enough, sharp enough, to drown out everything sitting underneath them. But before you can understand why it stings the way it does, you have to let go of what you've probably already assumed it means. Here's the interpretation almost every man reaches for first, and here's the problem with it. When a woman belittles a man, the instinctive read is simple. She thinks less of me. I'm not enough for her. I've disappointed her somehow, maybe in a way I can't even fully name. It feels logical in the moment. It feels like the obvious conclusion, the only conclusion that fits the sting of what just happened. But logic built on incomplete information tends to point in exactly the wrong direction, even when it feels airtight from the inside. Consider a specific version of this. A man makes a decision, where to eat, how to spend a Saturday, how to respond to a family situation that came up unexpectedly, and instead of agreement, he gets a dismissive comment, something that sounds almost mocking, delivered in a tone that catches him off guard. His mind jumps immediately to judgment. She thinks I handled that badly. She's losing respect for me. Something in me isn't measuring up right now. But watch what happens when you slow the moment down instead of reacting to it in real time. In that exact instant, she isn't running a formal evaluation of your competence, weighing evidence and reaching a verdict. She's reacting, fast, emotional, and often before she's even fully aware of what actually triggered it in her. That distinction matters more than it seems on the surface. Judgment is calculated, considered, built over time. Reaction is not. It arrives before thought does. Of course, this doesn't mean her words are meaningless, or that you should simply shrug off how they land on you. But the meaning underneath them is rarely the verdict it appears to be at first. Now, you might be thinking, doesn't that let her off the hook a little too easily? Not exactly. Understanding the source of a reaction doesn't erase its impact. It just points you toward what actually needs addressing. If it's not a verdict on your worth, then something else has to be driving it. Some force building underneath the moment, waiting for a place to go. And that force is not what most men assume it is. To answer that, you have to look at what's happening inside her nervous system in the seconds before the words come out. She's not aiming at you. She's venting around you, and you happen to be standing there. This is one of the hardest things for men to accept because it feels almost too simple, too easy an explanation for something that felt so personal in the moment it happened. But behavioral psychologists who study emotional regulation describe something called affect spillover, the tendency for unresolved emotional pressure in one area of life to leak out in an entirely unrelated moment, directed at whoever happens to be closest when it finally surfaces. In plain terms, the feeling has to go somewhere, and proximity decides exactly where that somewhere is. You might be thinking, couldn't this just be her personality, or a habit she's always had? Something baked into how she communicates? Sometimes, yes, personality plays a real role in how pressure gets expressed outwardly. But here's the detail that separates habit from signal, and it's simpler than it sounds. Watch the timing. Genuine personality traits show up consistently, evenly, regardless of context or circumstance. Pressure-driven belittling does not behave that way. It clusters. It shows up in tight bursts, usually following a period where something else went completely unspoken. A stressful week at work she never mentioned out loud. A conversation she wanted to have but didn't quite know how to start, so she let it pass. A moment earlier in the day where she felt unheard, briefly, and said nothing about it at the time. None of that pressure disappears just because it goes unspoken. It doesn't evaporate. It sits, quietly, gathering weight in the background of an otherwise ordinary day. And when it finally exits, it rarely exits as a calm, well-formed sentence delivered with clarity and intention. It exits sideways instead, sharp, clipped, aimed at whatever happens to be closest and easiest to hit. That's usually you, not because you deserve it, and not because you did anything wrong in that instant, but because you're present, and because on some unconscious level, she trusts you enough to be careless around you without fear of losing you. That last part tends to surprise men the most, once they actually sit with it. Before we move to what's actually underneath that pressure, there is one layer most explanations skip entirely, and it's an important one. The fact that this pattern almost never shows up randomly, disconnected from any real cause. It shows up in response to something specific, something unmet, something that was quietly missing before the moment even began. It's worth pausing here because this is where most explanations go wrong. They treat every sharp comment as an isolated event, something that appears out of nowhere. But pressure doesn't work that way in anyone. It accumulates in layers, invisible from the outside until it breaks the surface. That's what you're actually witnessing when the comment lands. Not the cause itself, but the release valve for something that's been building far longer than the moment suggests. That pressure almost always traces back to one of two things, and one of them will genuinely surprise you. There are really only two things she's missing when this happens, almost never more than that, no matter how complicated the moment feels while you're inside it. The first is the need to feel led, not controlled, not overruled, not managed, but met by someone willing to hold direction when things feel uncertain and undecided. Picture a stalled decision, something ordinary. Where to go for a weekend, how to handle a scheduling conflict with family, whether to commit to a plan or leave it open. It sits unresolved for days because neither of you fully commits to an answer, and it keeps quietly resurfacing without ever getting settled. On the surface, it looks harmless, almost trivial. Underneath, something quietly erodes with each round of it. When a woman repeatedly senses that no one is steering, a specific kind of frustration builds, one that's easy to misread. Not because she can't decide things herself, she likely can and does constantly in other areas of her life. But because carrying that weight alone, especially inside a relationship that's supposed to share it, starts to feel less like partnership and more like quiet, ongoing, unsupported effort. That frustration rarely gets spoken directly, in a clear sentence you could respond to. It gets spoken sideways instead, through comments that sound like criticism on the surface, but are actually much closer to exhaustion underneath. The second need is different, and in some ways more delicate to describe. The need to feel emotionally seen. This one tends to show up after a moment where she expressed something, even briefly, and it passed without any real acknowledgement. Maybe she mentioned feeling overwhelmed in a single passing sentence, half a comment really, and the conversation simply moved on to something else. She may not even consciously register it as a wound at the time, but the brain keeps a quiet, ongoing tally of moments where a bid for connection went unanswered, and belittling can become the delayed echo of that tally, arriving days later over something completely unrelated. Of course, not every sharp comment traces back to one of these two things specifically. Context always matters here, and some moments really are just fatigue, or a genuinely bad day that has nothing to do with either need. But when the pattern repeats itself, one of these two is almost always sitting underneath it. It also helps to know that these two needs rarely announce themselves cleanly. A woman going through this usually can't tell you, in the moment, which one she's actually feeling. The feeling arrives as irritation long before it arrives as insight. That's part of why the comment comes out sideways instead of directly. She's not withholding the real message on purpose. She often doesn't have conscious access to it yet herself. Once you can tell these two apart, something else becomes obvious almost immediately. The timing of when it happens is never actually random. It's not random, and it's not just her mood. There's a sequence, and it repeats. Remember what I told you at the start of this video? That there was one signal most men not only miss, but actively misread when it's happening right in front of them? We are getting close to it now, closer than you might realize. Here's how the sequence tends to unfold, step by step, once you know where to look for it. First, a small disconnect occurs, a moment where the two of you are technically together, but not actually aligned in that moment. Maybe you're in the same room, physically present, but distracted, half listening, already thinking 2 steps ahead about something else entirely. She notices, even if she doesn't say a single word about it. Second, that disconnect goes completely unspoken. She doesn't name it directly because naming it out loud feels like starting a conflict over something that seems far too small to justify bringing up. So it sits there, unaddressed. Third, that unspoken feeling compounds, often across hours, sometimes across a full day, quietly gathering weight the way small debts gather interest in the background. And then, almost always over something unrelated and genuinely minor, the choice of restaurant, an offhand comment about traffic, a joke that lands wrong, it surfaces as something sharp and dismissive, aimed directly at you. Now, you might be thinking, sometimes she really is just tired, or stressed about something that has nothing to do with either of you at all. And that's true, it absolutely happens, and not every sharp moment fits this sequence. But here's the detail that separates a genuinely tired moment from this one. A tired comment tends to be followed by softness soon after, an apology, a small gesture, a natural return to warmth within a short while. A pressure-driven comment from this sequence tends to linger instead, unresolved, hanging in the air, because the underlying disconnect that actually caused it hasn't been addressed at all. This is where most men unintentionally make the pattern worse. Either they withdraw completely, going quiet and distant for the rest of the day, matching her tension with their own, or they defend themselves point by point, cataloging every reason the comment wasn't fair, which only adds a new layer of disconnect stacked on top of the original one. Neither response actually touches the real cause underneath. There's a reason both of these instinctive reactions feel so satisfying in the moment, even though neither one works. Withdrawal feels like protecting yourself. Defending your position feels like restoring fairness. Both are perfectly reasonable impulses on their own. But this particular sequence was never about fairness or protection in the first place. It was about an unspoken disconnect finally finding an exit. Responding to the exit instead of the disconnect is like treating the smoke alarm instead of the fire. That is the moment most men walk away from without ever realizing what just happened. This is where most men either make it worse without realizing it, or, once they finally see it clearly, quietly change everything that follows. Here's the part almost nobody tells you, and it's the one thing that actually shifts this pattern once you understand it. It isn't a clever comeback, and it was never going to be. It isn't silence either, and it isn't over-explaining yourself in the moment, listing out every reason the comment wasn't fair. Both of those responses, as different as they seem on the surface, do exactly the same thing underneath. They add distance, precisely when the moment is quietly asking for the opposite of that. What actually interrupts the pattern is something much quieter than either instinct, something psychologists sometimes call attuned steadiness, staying emotionally present and genuinely unbothered by the sharp comment, without either collapsing into apology or hardening into defense against it. In practice, that might look like acknowledging the comment briefly, without matching its edge or escalating it further, and then gently naming the disconnect that's actually sitting underneath. Not with a lecture, not with a full analysis delivered on the spot, however accurate it might feel. Something as simple as noticing out loud that something seems a little off between you, and then staying present long enough for her to genuinely feel that you noticed it. Of course, this isn't about becoming a pushover or quietly absorbing every sharp comment without ever addressing a real pattern of disrespect, if that's genuinely what's happening. That distinction matters, and context always decides which situation you're actually in. This is specifically about the ordinary, repeating moments where pressure is leaking sideways, not the rarer moments where something has genuinely gone wrong between the two of you. Steadiness in that specific moment does something most men consistently underestimate. It signals that you noticed. It signals that you're not rattled by it. It signals that you're still fully there, present, unshaken, which is often the exact thing the moment was quietly asking for in the first place, underneath all the sharpness. Over time, this response does something more than simply diffuse a single comment in isolation. It starts to close the underlying gap that caused it in the first place, which means the comments themselves gradually lose their reason for existing at all. There's something worth sitting with here. This isn't a technique you perform once and forget about. It's closer to a habit of presence, something you build the same way trust itself gets built, in small, repeated moments rather than one dramatic gesture. Most men look for the single right thing to say. What actually works is smaller than that and steadier than that. That is the moment most men walk away from without ever realizing it. The version where nothing really needed to be said out loud, only felt, only noticed. Once this clicks for you, you'll start to notice it everywhere. Not just in her, but in the pattern itself, playing out in real time. So here's the pattern, laid out plainly. When a woman belittles a man, it is almost never a verdict on who he is. And it was never really about the comment itself. It is a signal, distorted by pressure, pointing to something sitting underneath it. Usually the need to feel led, or the need to feel emotionally seen, sometimes both at once. That's the zoomed out truth worth carrying with you. You don't need to overanalyze every sharp comment that comes your way. And you don't need to treat every offhand remark like evidence of something bigger. Most of the time, you simply need to notice the pattern, stay steady instead of reacting, and gently close the gap underneath it. That's it. Has this happened in your relationship recently? And looking back now, can you tell which of the two needs it actually was? I read every single comment, and I want to hear which one you recognized. On this channel, we look at the female mind honestly, without games and without guesswork, so you can understand what's actually happening instead of guessing at it in the dark. Next time, I'll show you the exact 4-second window right before she pulls away, the moment almost no man notices, because it doesn't look anything like withdrawal at all.